Thank you for standing by and welcome to the Disaster Preparedness and Response Toolkit demonstration. All participants are now in a listen-only mode. Later, there will be an opportunity for questions. Should you require assistance during the call, please press star 0. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded. I'd like to turn it over to Jane Sharita. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much and welcome everyone. We're happy that you joined us today to learn more about the recently released Disaster Preparedness and Recovery Toolkit. I'll go over some logistics quickly. The audio is being recorded today. It, along with the PowerPoint and a transcript, will be available in about 7 to 10 days. I will send a listserv with a link to the archive on HUD Exchange so that you can access that information if you like. Slide handouts were sent this morning, and they are also available in the little box to the right of your screen in the handouts section if you'd like to follow along and make notes. You can do a quick printout. We will be taking questions and comments at the end of the presentation, and we also have polling questions interspersed throughout the webinar, and we hope that you do respond to those. You can also ask questions by writing them in to the question box on the side of your screen, or if you prefer, you can send your questions and comments to our housing.counseling@hud.gov mailbox, and just go ahead and put today's webinar topic in the subject line. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Jerry Mayer, Director of the Office of Outreach and Capacity Building, Office of Housing Counseling. Thank you, Jerry.
Well, thank you, Jane, and good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to today's Housing Counseling webinar. Natural and man-made disasters continue to affect communities nationwide, and housing counseling agencies are in a unique position to help their communities prepare for and recover from a disaster. They can help their clients prepare for disasters by integrating preparedness into their counseling and educational activities. Post-disasters, they can use their knowledge of local resources and programs to help clients navigate the complexities of disaster recovery resources and programs. HUD's Office of Housing Counseling, together with ICF and the HUD Exchange, have created a new Housing Counseling Disaster Recovery Toolkit. The toolkit will help housing counselors prepare for disasters and plan to resume and then maintain operations in the post-disaster environment. I'm pleased to introduce Brandy Bones of ICF, who will be leading today's webinar. So without further ado, take it away, Brandy.
Thank you, Jerry. Hello, this is Brandy Bones, and as Jerry said, I'm with ICF, and we are a technical assistance provider that's working in support of the Office of Housing Counseling, and we helped both develop this webinar as well as the toolkit that we'll be demonstrating and kind of going over today. I've been working in disaster recovery for about 12 years. I do a lot of work with HUD's Office of Block Grant Assistance and the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery grant program, and I've worked in other disaster recovery spaces all over the country, and have been working over the past year with the Office of Housing Counseling on a number of disaster recovery-related resources, including this toolkit. So I'm going to walk you through that, and I want to introduce you now to my colleague, Rachel Lorillard, who's going to actually do the demo. Rachel?
Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm the Deputy Project Manager for all of the housing counseling content on the HUD Exchange, and I also manage some of the other web pages and resources for other HUD programs across the website. Thanks, Brandy.
Thank you. And now, Jane, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jane Sharita, and I work with ICF on our products that we bring to you, and the development of the toolkit was our most recent one.
Great, and then Jenny is on the phone.
No, I believe she wasn't able to join us today.
Okay, cool. So that'll who will have giving a presentation and overview of, and so now I just want to go over the agenda for the call. So the first thing we'll talk about is kind of the audience and purpose of the toolkit and how it came to be and what's intended for and who it really is ideally used by. And then an overview of our development process, so how we went about actually developing the toolkit itself. And then I'll hand it over to Rachel, who will do a demonstration, and then we'll walk through some other additional related resources that are really helpful to use in coordination with the toolkit. And as Jane said, we'll have a time for question and answers at the end as well, and you can always feel free to ask questions throughout, and we'll hit all of those. And we will have 3 polling questions along the way. So the first thing, the audience and purpose. So as Jerry touched on, obviously disasters have been on the rise, and housing counseling agencies are increasingly involved in helping clients recover from disasters. They're often on the front lines, working directly with clients who need assistance after they've been impacted by a disaster. And the Office of Counseling, recognizing that there was a need to really equip housing counseling agencies with additional resources and tools so that they can be better prepared to help both themselves from an organizational perspective prepare for disasters and recover more quickly so they can get back on their feet and do the job of helping their clients recover, as well as help their clients prepare for and recover from disasters. So the audience here is housing counseling agencies, intermediaries, state housing finance agencies, and multi-state organizations. And then the purpose here, if we've done our job, is to provide best practices, resources, and tools that will really enable housing counseling agencies, intermediaries, state housing finance agencies, and multi-state organizations play an active and effective role when it comes to disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. So I'm going to start off first with a polling question just to get a sense of what everyone is dealing with, because you're all on the phone, either because you're in an area that's prone to disasters, maybe you've experienced a disaster and have dealt with the aftermath. So if you can, the poll is now open. Please select all that apply of what type of disasters have you experienced in your area. The options are hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, fires, or we have it all. And we'll wait a little bit for everyone to respond. Okay, so looking at the results, we look like hurricanes at 36%, tornadoes same at 36%, flooding is the highest at 77%, which is not surprising. That is probably the largest hazard risk facing United States. Fires at 32%, and then 10% of you have it all, or probably some combination of natural hazard risks that you're facing in your communities. So let's talk about the development process so you can give you kind of a background on how this tool came to be. And we came up with this webinar for you. So, are we at polling question number 2? Sorry. Yeah, development. Thank you. So overall, we, as we mentioned, we've been working in close partnership with the Office of Housing Counseling to develop this toolkit. And really importantly, and I think this is increasingly happening across the board, as there's more disasters and there's just so many different funding sources in play, there was a lot of coordination with other HUD offices that are involved in disaster recovery efforts, as well as experts that work in different areas of preparedness, response, and recovery. So, for example, I mentioned in the introduction, I do a lot of work on HUD's disaster recovery CDBG-DR program. So we worked and consulted with that office, as well as the Office of Public and Indian Housing, which is often very involved in direct disaster response and recovery due to the assets that they manage that is often in disaster-impacted areas. And we also touched and worked with FEMA to get their input and other FEMA experts. So every resource in that way was kind of vetted where applicable to make sure that they reflected kind of all of the various agencies that may be involved in preparedness, response, and recovery and those different perspectives. We also conducted user testing, which took place this past May, and we worked with 6 organizations. 3 of them were housing counseling agency, 2 were HUD intermediaries, and there was 1 housing counseling consultant that's worked with a number of housing counseling agencies across the company or across the country, basically doing user testing where we did a combination of demoing the toolkit to make sure from a user perspective it made sense, It was easy to use and follow in terms of content and organization, and then actually provided some of the sample drafts of the tools and resources and asked for their direct feedback on the content to make sure that it really resonated and was going to be useful. Of course, this continues to be something that we can always improve upon, but we really got on-the-ground feedback in order to ensure that it was as relevant as possible to the needs of housing counseling agencies working directly on the ground. So now we have a second polling question. How has your agency participated in past disasters? And you can select all that apply when you're responding. So 1, provided resources to our clients. 2, participated in community outreach, consulted with our region's CDBG DR grantee, implemented organizational disaster plans and best practices, or not applicable. You haven't experienced a disaster either yet or hopefully never. And the poll is open. Okay, great. So it sounds like the highest one is provided resources to our clients. So in some way you've helped your clients to prepare for and recover from disasters at 72%. Others, 53%, have participated in community outreach. 13% have consulted with our region's CDBG DR grantee. And for some of you that may not be applicable, but that's actually a pretty good percentage of people that are directly working with their CDBG DR grantee. And then 38%, and this is a great number as well, implemented organizational disaster plans and best practices. And then 18% have not experienced a disaster, but it's good that you're on the phone call to kind of prepare for it. Great. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Rachel, who's going to walk through a demonstration of the actual toolkit.
Thanks, Brandy. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel. As I said before, I manage a bunch of the housing counseling resources and content on the HUD Exchange, and developed this toolkit in part with Brandy and others on the housing counseling team and ICF. So I'm going to do a demo of the toolkit web pages for you now. I'm going to pull up my screen for everyone to see. So this is the toolkit landing page, and you can actually access the landing page right from the housing counseling homepage. There is a big announcement right in the middle of the screen, so it's very easy to access. But in the future, as other resources roll out, this announcement will go away. However, it will always be available in the disaster recovery section of the housing counseling website. So that's how you access the toolkit. And once you arrive at the landing page, you can see that there are 2 different guides we developed for you to read through. So this is pretty self-explanatory, but you either need to prepare for a disaster before one happens or figure out how to operate post-disaster once your community has already experienced a disaster. So we're hoping that everyone will find both of these useful. For those of you who responded to the poll that you've never experienced a disaster in your community before, we think the preparing section will have a lot of good information for you to develop some resources and prepare for a disaster if one should ever happen. And then for those of you who are currently working post-disaster in your communities to recover right now, the operating section will have a lot of great tools and resources for you. I also wanted to point out that there's an About This Toolkit section at the top of the page. So if you forward the toolkit to a colleague or someone interested in this information and they need more orientation for how to use the toolkit or who the audience is, this is a good orientation for them to get started. All right, so first I'm going to cover the Preparing for a Disaster guide. I'll go back to my web page. Now, before I talk a little bit about the Preparing for a Disaster guide content, I'm going to spend a little bit talking about the functionality of the toolkit. So you can scroll through the information in this toolkit in a couple of different ways. Let's say you get to the landing page and you're really just interested in the client preparedness resources. Let's say you're specifically interested in helping a client financially prepare for a disaster, you could use the top navigation on the screen to jump right to the client preparedness section. So it takes you all the way down the page, and you can jump back to the introduction or to any other section using the top navigation as well. You can also view all of the information on the page just by continuously scrolling. So for example, if I scroll down the page, you'll see the organizational preparedness section, and then if you keep scrolling, you'll see community preparedness, and so forth. So there's sort of two different ways that you can jump around, and hopefully, depending on what resources you want to use or whether you want to read the full toolkit from beginning to end, you can do either one of those. Another thing to note about the functionality is that there is a glossary of terms button on the right side of the page. And the glossary of terms is really useful if you're reading through the toolkit and you don't know what either maybe a disaster recovery term is referring to, or maybe you're a little bit confused about some housing counseling terminology. This is a great place to go to the glossary of terms, download this PDF, and you can sort of read through all of these crucial terms and agencies that we refer to throughout the toolkit. All right, so I'm going to go back to the preparing section now, and I'm just going to scroll through the toolkit and call out some of the important content as I go. So the introduction section provides a lot of orientation for how to use this guide and how we hope people can utilize these tools to become prepared, and then a little bit about who the audience of the toolkit is, which Brandy has already done a great job providing. Now, the organizational preparedness section of the toolkit really gets into how your agency can prepare for a disaster. So not only do agencies need to make sure that their clients are prepared for emergencies, but the agency itself has to have plans in place so that it can continue functioning after a disaster occurs, and they can really help their community and clients in turn cope with the disaster. So there's two resources covered in this section that are going to be super important. The Emergency Response Plan guides an organization's actions in the initial minutes of an emergency. And the main goals are life safety and stabilization of the incident in order to minimize the short-term damage to the agency. So this section of the toolkit really gets into how to develop that and tailor it to your own agency. Then the Continuity of Operations Plan, or COOP, is the second tool that we touch on in this section, and the COOP prepares your agency to maintain its essential functions after a disaster event. So ensuring continuous operations, protecting facilities, equipment, and records, and then facilitating an orderly recovery so that normal services to clients can resume as quickly as possible. It's really important to have this in place prior to the disaster. That way you're not having to think about that stuff after the disaster happens. So I'll move on to the community preparedness section. So this section is really intended to help counselors and agencies identify the disaster recovery services that they can provide to their communities. It's also important to learn how to advertise your capabilities within your community. If people don't know that you exist and are able to provide post-disaster recovery help or preparing for disaster help, then when a disaster occurs, they won't know that they can reach out to you for that type of assistance. This section also covers how to engage with potential partners and become involved with preparedness efforts. So there are a bunch of different community organizations and entities providing disaster preparedness and recovery efforts, so it's really important to make those partnerships and connections before a disaster happens. That way, after a disaster, you already have those partnerships in place. I'm going to keep scrolling to the client preparedness section. So this really talks about how to counsel your clients to be prepared for a disaster a little bit of planning can definitely go a long way. And we have 2 different checklists that are available here, one to counsel your client on financial preparedness and one to counsel them on home and family preparedness. If they follow these tools and guidance, it'll just be a lot easier for them to recover once a disaster happens and for you to guide them through that recovery. All right, so finally we have the Download All Tools section, and there's a section like this in each of the guides. It links to each tool mentioned throughout the guide individually, but you can also download a zip file and have all of the tools right on your desktop immediately if you want that. So I'm just going to open a couple of the tools that I talked about and just touch on their importance a little bit. So I'm going to open the COOP. So we provided the COOP in a Word document form as opposed to a PDF like most of the other tools because as I scroll through it, you'll see, but there is an ability for you to edit the COOP to mention your specific organization and tailor it to your specific agency's needs. So we're hoping that people can download this, read through the instructions, and then really just edit the text so that they can use this document as their COOP. So this document goes through what a COOP is, which I've already touched on, how a housing counseling agency can play a role in the community after a disaster, and then it really talks about the best way to develop a COOP, which touches on a few key items like identifying alternate facilities, securing your documents, personal information, and then developing really solid procedures for what happens after a disaster. Now here's the template section where you can really tailor this document to your agency's needs. It walks through your agency's objectives post-disaster. It scopes out the plan so that you have key functions and also responsible personnel, resources, and preparation that needs to take place for each item. And then it walks through a bunch of different staff responsibilities. So one of the crucial elements post-disaster will be naming the people in your organization and exactly what their responsibilities are. This isn't something that many people think about before a disaster happens, but it's really crucial to know, okay, I'm the executive director, a disaster's occurred, what are my specific responsibilities here? And same with some other people in your organization, like the HR manager, the facility manager, records, training, etc. And you can assign these staff roles to people if they don't have full-time positions designated for those roles. There's also a COOP activation section, and this really talks about how to activate your COOP and what to do if an emergency happens during work hours, what to do if it happens during non-work hours, etc. And finally, there's a resuming operations section, which talks a little bit about the longer period after a disaster happens and how to get back to your typical operations. And finally, there's an appendix which offers an emergency staffing plan where you can further name the staff responsible for each responsibilities. And you can add more responsibilities or delete responsibilities as tailored to your organization. All right, so that's the COOP. I also wanted to touch on the Partners for Disaster Recovery document. This document really helps your agency determine potential partners both in their community and at a federal level. It's like I mentioned earlier, it's really important to sort of reach out to the other partners in your community that are offering disaster relief or disaster preparedness activities and talk about how you can work together to meet your community's needs and meet your clients' needs. So this just provides a few of those agencies, so for example, FEMA, SBA, et cetera, and then also local partners, and it provides links to those organizations when available. All right, and then the last tool that I wanted to touch on was the financial preparedness tool for your clients. This tool is really meant for you to take, and when you meet with your clients, walk them through these steps of how they can prepare for a disaster personally and financially. So there's a lot of different steps that can really help a client prepare and make the recovery process a lot easier. So some of these are taking inventory of your important documents, taking photographs of valuable belongings, assessing your insurance coverage. If you have a good understanding of your insurance coverage prior to a disaster, it's a lot easier to deal with post-disaster. Reviewing your home insurance policy and then understanding flood insurance is also crucial. And then how to plan your next steps. We have a FEMA emergency financial first aid kit and some other resources that are linked to here. All right, so that is the preparing for a disaster section. And now I'll cover the operating post-disaster section. So these are all the tools that will be crucial once your community has experienced a disaster. Hopefully not, but I know a bunch of us on the call already have had those happen in our communities. So to get to the other guide, you can either link to it or click on the link from the introduction section of this guide, or you can jump back to the landing page and click on the operating post-disaster link. All right, so this page functions just like the preparing for a disaster page. You can use the top navigation to jump to each section of interest. You can scroll through the page, or you can click on the glossary of terms if you come across anything that you're not familiar with. Just like the other guide, the introduction section just offers some orientation to what sorts of information you'll find in the operating post-disaster guide. Now in this section, the organizational recovery part of the guide really talks about the COOP and the emergency response plan as well. But in this guide, it talks about how to put these into action and implement them after a disaster so that you can get back to your normal operations as quickly as possible. And we also provide links to those tools here as well. So moving on, the community recovery guide. This really talks about how to consider the recovery services needed and conduct outreach in your community to reach your clients. So one of the most important things following a disaster will make sure that you're contacting all of the clients that you need to contact, reaching out to the community partners that you need to work with, and just making sure that the people in your community know that you're a resource that is there to help them work through the disaster that they experienced. And it's also really important to work with those partners that I mentioned earlier and make sure that everyone's getting the assistance that they need. And then finally, the client recovery guide has a lot of really targeted tools that can help your clients throughout the recovery process. Since there are a ton of different pieces and things to worry about following a disaster, we developed these tools and checklists with the intention that you can just print them out or look at them on your computer with your client, walk them through the checklist, take them step by step through each thing that they may need to think about following a disaster, and just really get them the information they need. And then supporting your clients throughout every step of the recovery process is really crucial. So this could include financial assessments, filing insurance claims, working with contractors, or rebuilding a safe and healthy home. And counselors can also help clients navigate a myriad of other post-disaster issues like avoiding foreclosure or eviction, things like that. And just like the other guide, this section of the toolkit also provides you with the opportunity to click on the link to each tool mentioned throughout or download a zip file of all the tools in the toolkit. So I'm going to call out a couple of the tools that are available here for your use. First of all, the Federal Disaster Recovery Funding Resources infographic. This can be really useful to know what funding sources are available to individuals and households after a disaster occurs. There's a lot of different funding, but different people are eligible, and it all covers different items. So this infographic is a good way to compare all the different funding that you could be eligible for, your clients could be eligible for, and talking about what exactly is covered under each type of funding. So just a few of the funding sources, for example, are FEMA assistance, the SBA Disaster Loan Program. There's a variety of different HUD financial assistance available, and then a few different USDA funding sources as well. All right, another tool I wanted to call out is this Counseling for Household Recovery tool. So you'll see we have a lot of different tools for how to counsel your client on different types of topics. And a lot of them get into really targeted and in the weeds on a few issues. So the Counseling on Insurance Claims document gets into the weeds on really how to file insurance claims and work with insurance providers following a disaster. The Household Recovery document does a good job of providing a high-level overview on each of those topics. So if you're looking for a quick document that really walks you through at a high level some of those deeper issues, this is a really good checklist to look at. So some of the topics it covers include how to file insurance claims, how to contact your mortgage lender, how to contact other creditors that you might work with, and then sort of protecting your finances, so protecting your credit rating, protecting your income. And then finally, applying for disaster assistance, managing the rebuilding process, avoiding scams and taking care of yourself, and then planning for your next steps, which is always important financially and with your home. All right, and then the last tool I wanted to call out is the Avoiding Post-Disaster Scams and Frauds document. This is a good document because it really summarizes some of the common scams and sort of fraudulent issues that arise after a disaster. The majority of the people that you speak to after a disaster have great intentions and are solid community partners, but there are people that are looking for a chance to scam people and use a disaster as an opportunity to make money. So this document just really walks your client through how to make sure you're vetting the contractors they're working with, the charities they're donating to, everything like that, so that all of their money is going to really legitimate companies and organizations. All right, so that is the Operating Post-Disaster Toolkit. And I think next we're going to do our final polling question. So now that you've seen the toolkit and gone through our demonstration of how to use it, when do you think you will access the toolkit? So 1, you viewed it and used it already. That's great because it's only been out for about a week. 2 is that you'll access it as soon as the webinar is over. 3 is that you'll access it over the next few weeks. You can never be too prepared for a disaster in my book. You know, that's what I always say. Or before the next disaster for certain. Whoops, skipped ahead there. So I'll give everyone a couple minutes to respond to the poll. All right, so it looks like we have 11% saying they viewed and used it already. So like I said, that's really great because it hasn't been available for that long yet. We just launched last week. 25% of you say that you'll access it as soon as the webinar is over. That's also great. We're hoping that everyone gets the most use out of this as possible. And then 56% say over the next few weeks. You can never be too prepared. That's awesome. And then 8% before the next disaster for certain. So that's great. All right, I'll move on to questions now. I think we're going to take a couple questions and open the phone lines.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to ask a question, please press star then 0. An operator will gather your name and further instruct you. Once again, please press star 0 for questions.
While we're waiting for the call-in questions, we do have a question about, is there a section in post-disaster on managing reflected trauma? I believe it's reflected trauma. I'm not sure.
There is a section
related trauma.
Thanks, Jane. Yeah, there is a section on how to manage post-disaster trauma, and our key point there is really that counselors and agencies should, be there for their clients and then really be willing to make referrals to mental health organizations that are equipped to handle those accompanying traumas and stresses, which is super common for people to experience after a disaster.
That's an excellent point, Rachel. We're definitely not expecting counselors to be mental health professionals, but to have the tools they need to make the proper referrals.
Mm-hmm.
Operator, do we have any call-ins?
There are currently no questions in queue.
Thank you. Rachel, if you could go over the way to access the toolkit again, starting with accessing HUD Exchange.
Sure.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, and then I have a few other resources to share as well if we don't have any call-in questions.
Okay.
Okay, so like I said earlier, I can just go back to the HUD Exchange main landing page. So if you go to just hudexchange.info, you can get to housing counseling by clicking on the programs drop-down, and you can see the housing counseling program. And then once you're on the housing counseling landing page, like I said earlier, right now we have a big announcement. You can't miss it because we just launched. But the announcements on the main section of the page rotate out as new tools and resources become available. So you can, if you come to the page and it's no longer listed, you can always find it by going to the Disaster Recovery Emergency Preparedness Toolkit. And it's the first item under Disaster Recovery Toolkit. So that's how you get there from the HUD Exchange.
Rachel, any questions, operator?
There are no questions in queue.
Well, we do have a couple of written-in questions.
Okay,
one is, do you have a section on understanding how the mortgage forgiveness period works?
So we do have a section of the toolkit on how to work with creditors and other lenders. And our guidance in that section is to really contact your mortgage provider and understand what their policy is for post-disaster mortgage payments. So every creditor and provider is a little different, and the terms of forbearance or anything like that might change based on your provider. So we do have a section on that and how to counsel your clients for that, but the guidance is always to contact your provider or your lender first.
And in addition to that, though, going back to the resource that Rachel shared on the various different kinds of most common types of disaster recovery assistance available to individuals and households, there are some programs that specifically help provide mortgage assistance in that time period where people are, out of a job because of a result of a disaster, are doing part of, rebuilding, can't live, and also have to rent. So oftentimes specific to your community, you should also be coordinating with other community partners and agencies to see what available funding and programs are available. And the resources that are in the community recovery section that talk about the partners and talk about the resources can give you a lot of information about what's going to typically be available after a disaster.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Brandy.
Another question is, just in case there is a loss of utilities, would you suggest the print-out manual for disaster recovery purposes?
Yeah, we definitely created all the tools with the intention that they could be printed out. So if you download the zip file of all the tools in the guide, it'll just be on your desktop, and then you can access it whether or not you have access to internet, because that's a good point. A lot of times there's loss of internet following a disaster.
And part of the emergency response plan and the continuity of operations plan is actually going to address that explicitly, how you help to eliminate or significantly reduce the risk of being completely offline and off-grid for a long period of time after a disaster. So, and even just creating a COOP, you're going to go a long way towards avoiding those kinds of issues, not just this toolkit, but think about all the files and critical information you need to get back up and resume operations.
Are there any callers in the queue?
There are no questions in queue.
Thank you.
Right.
Rachel, would you like to go through the resources?
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Okay, so in the guide or the PowerPoint that we distributed prior to the webinar and in the handouts box, we have slides that that list all the toolkit tools that I covered and talked about during this session for both preparing for a disaster and operating post-disaster. So I know I covered, for preparing for a disaster, I covered the COOP, the partners, and the financial preparedness guide. But just so everyone is aware that there are a bunch more tools in both guides that I didn't cover, and some of those are the emergency response plan guidance, the overview of housing counseling disaster recovery services, which really just talks about all of the different things that housing counseling agencies are able to provide to their clients before and after a disaster occurs. There's also a sample promotional flyer that HCAs can distribute around their community and post different places so that people know that housing counseling agencies are a resource for them. And then there's also a home and family preparedness toolkit that you can use with your client to make sure that they have everything in their house and with their family all set in case a disaster occurs. Then in the operating post-disaster guide, there are a few resources I didn't touch on yet, which include the disaster preparedness and recovery resources, which just offer a bunch of different links and further information that both counselors and clients can find useful following a disaster. There are also separate tools and guidance for filing insurance claims, working with contractors, counseling for healthy homes after a disaster, and then coping with trauma post-disaster, which we talked about a little bit when someone asked their question. And then finally, there are a few other tools and resources on the HUD Exchange that I wanted to talk about with folks. So I'll pull back up the HUD Exchange. The housing counseling landing page we discussed, but this has a lot of great tools for disaster preparedness, but also just for housing counseling agencies in general. If you're looking for any resources for housing counseling agencies, you can always come to this landing page and you'll find all the links that you need either on the right sidebar or in those toolkits I showed you earlier. You can also view upcoming training, so if you are looking for more training about housing counseling agencies and disaster preparedness or any other topics, you can find that in the training digest. I also wanted to cover the disaster and emergency resource page for housing counselors. So this page is really meant to be a collection of resources and notifications that are specific to disasters that have occurred in the past year. So we all know that there were a ton of disasters in late summer to early fall 2017, and then continuing through this year. So this is really a collection of all of those disaster declarations from FEMA, and then some specific resources and announcements for different disasters. So, for example, Fannie Mae put out some guidance about the California wildfires. FEMA had a resource page specifically for Hurricane Nate, etc. So this is where the Office of Housing Counseling posts those very specific and timely resources for disasters happening now. And then there are a few other quick links on the General Disaster Recovery and Hurricane Resources section. So this is really helpful as well if you're looking for, let's say, the Red Cross, or just quick links for different topics. Another resource that I wanted to call out, which was created a while ago on the HUD Exchange by the Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs, is this Disaster Recovery Homelessness Toolkit. This is really targeted towards assisting the homeless and other special populations following a disaster, since those are some of the most vulnerable populations following a disaster event. So this is really good information if this is an issue in your community or you're looking to learn more about how to specifically help these vulnerable populations following a disaster. And then finally, there is a CDBG DR toolkit that talks about program launch and implementation. So I know a lot of housing counseling agencies are working with their CDBG DR grantees following disasters that have happened in the past year. So if you need any more information about the CDBG DR program or how those programs work or are implemented, this is a really great resource to get that information. And that's all I have for additional resources. Jane, do you want to cover the certificate?
Yes.
We have no other questions.
Oh, no, not. Do we have anything in the queue, operator?
There are no questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Brandy and Rachel, for this super helpful webinar and demo. Folks will get a certificate of training. It will be in an email format, so if you like, you can print it out or save the email to your records. You can also get credit by going to the webinar archive on HUD Exchange and click the Get Credit for this training button. And also, if you do think of any other questions or comments that you would like to share with us, or any ideas on other components for the toolkit, we would love to get that information. You could send that to our housing.counseling@hud.gov mailbox, and in the subject line, please type Disaster Preparedness and Recovery Toolkit Demonstration. Again, a listserv will be sent in about 7 to 10 days with the transcript for today's webinar, along with the slide deck and audio replay number. So thank you all for attending, and glad you could join us. Bye-bye.
That does conclude our conference for today. Thank you for your participation. You may now disconnect.